So thank you so much for opportunity to present our paper. This is a joint paper with our colleagues from the World Bank, Hayan Dan and Michael Lokshin. So I will continue extending the area of subjective scales, but now we will talk about Russia and the important role of equivalent scales for poverty dynamic in Russia. This is the structure of our talk. We will talk about motivation literature, and I will talk briefly about empirical strategy. And most of the presentation will be devoted to estimation results. So our motivation is very simple, because obtaining comparable measure of income of different household size, of different household with different household size and composition is a crucial task for welfare measurement. We made several contributions. First of all, we are using alternative data, alternative subjective well-being data to estimate equivalent scales. These data were proved to approximate living standards more carefully than previously used data and objective data. Second, we will analyze the effect of scaling on poverty dynamic, particularly on chronic poverty. It's a very important, it has a very important policy application, because poverty reducing policy should be different in case of chronic poverty or temporary poverty. We also take a look at the effect of scaling on income dynamic and income mobility. Another contribution that we are using the longest run panel data, one of the longest run panel data in the literature. And this is also important, very important analysis for Russia, because poverty line, equivalent scales that are embedded in poverty line, they count for unequal distribution, but completely ignore economies of scale in joint consumption. So I will talk about our results in the end to save my time. So this is a table with all of the latest studies that were using long-run panel data for estimating subjective scales. As you can see, most of the studies were based on German data, British data, and one of the study was based on Swedish data. So we can say that demographic structure can be very different for these countries compared to Russia, and we can expect that our results would be very different too. Moreover, all of these studies used satisfaction questions that has some disadvantages too. Our estimation strategy for measuring scale elasticity is based on equation 1 when we determine our individual latent utility as a function of personal characteristics of the sum function of ratio of total household income and equivalent scale weights, where we will account for elasticity parameter, and as well we will account for some unobserved factors. This equation was first suggested by Schwartz, who said that individual evaluate satisfaction subjective level based on equivalent income, but not total income. If we will use these expressions, and we will put these expressions into equation again, we can get the equation 2. The equation 2 is our main equation for estimating scale, because we can directly derive scale parameters for household consisting of adults only, or for household consisting of adults with children. So So these parameters, E and B, are our main scale parameters that we will be estimating in our work. Our second strategy is to estimate. To estimate equation 2, we will use recently developed estimator that allow us to account for unobserved fixed effect while respecting the ordered nature of our dependent variable. I will skip it very easily to save my time. The another line in our paper is how we measure chronic poverty and income mobility. To measure the chronic poverty, we use a very common decomposition that is based on permanent income, and we define chronically poor as individuals for whom permanent income is lower than poverty line. Income mobility is measured with common mobility indices, with two versions of mobility indices as unconditional mobility and conditional mobility. So, for example, we can identify the probability of upward unconditional mobility as the probability of moving to a higher income category. We use Russian longitudinal monitoring survey as our main data. We cover the whole period from 1998 to 2017. It allows us to account for changing in household size and composition more carefully. We did some restriction with our sample. We follow the individuals over time, not household, but at the same time we cluster on this level as well. This is the sample distribution of our main dependent variable, subjective welfare variable. When the people were asked to put themselves on the step in 9-step ladder from the poorest to the richest. And you can see that it has some bell-shaped distribution with right tail, and we aggregate the latest two steps, we aggregate in one step. So this is our first main results with the scale parameters provided by 3 different models. So we show the results for pooled ordered model, for fixed effect linear model, and for our preferred model, this is blow up and cluster model. This is the last column. So you can see that elasticity, baseline elasticity, so-called elasticity for household consistent of adults only, is varying from 0.6 to 0.4 depending on the methods used. We can estimate the child parameter, child elasticity parameter. It can be varying too depending on the method. At the same time, we can say that overall elasticity is higher for aiding another adult than for aiding children. And we can see that while we are controlling for unobserved individual heterogeneity, our parameters are getting lower. We compare our results with commonly used equivalent scales. We can say that our scale parameter gives lower weight than the commonly used OECD scale, square root scale, per capita. It's very consistent with previous paper for Eastern Europe and European countries. And we can see the decrease in marginal costs for each child and adults for our scale. What are the implications of decreasing costs for Russia? First, we will calculate we will calculate new poverty lines for different household compositions and compare it with official poverty lines for this household. And we can say that new poverty lines are much lower than the official poverty lines, and the difference can be huge, up to up to 200%, depending on the poverty line that we are using. Next step, when we analyze the effect of scaling on poverty. First of all, we look at the effect of scale on headcount poverty using the latest data for 2017. So here we plot two graphs, two figures. When we measured headcount poverty using absolute poverty line and relative poverty line as a function of two scale parameters, child scale parameter and adult scale parameter. You can clearly see that cross-sectional poverty, headcount poverty, is very sensitive to adult scale parameter, and for example, for panel E, it can be varying from less than 5% to up to 20%. At the same time, it varies only marginally with child scale parameter. The same conclusion is for relative poverty line, but we have the reverse picture because relative poverty line is equalized by scale factors by construction. Then next we turn to poverty duration, longitudinal poverty. And here we measure poverty duration as a number of consecutive years, rounds in poverty. And we plot this graph as well for poverty duration that is measured with absolute poverty line and poverty duration that is measured with relative poverty lines. And the conclusion is very similar to previous pictures, that poverty duration is very sensitive to adult scale parameter and less sensitive to child parameter. Then we look at the chronic poverty by using the decomposition, and we are interested. We are using different poverty measures as a headcount poverty, poverty gap, squared poverty gap, and we are interested in the share of chronic poverty. So we are changing our adult scale parameter, and we are keeping child scale parameter fixed at some level. So you can see that conclusions about chronic poverty, about the magnitude of chronic poverty can be very different depending on the scale, on the scale value used. So this picture is very consistent as for absolute poverty line and relative poverty line. Next step and our last step, when we look at the effect of scaling on income mobility, on income dynamic. Here is more complex graph, and I will try to explain it very briefly. So for each version of mobility, we have two scenarios. We have upward mobility and we have downward mobility. These are two graphs. So upward mobility is presented with more gray plot, and downward mobility is presented with orange plot. So we can see as a so we plotted as a function of two scale parameters as well, and you can see that it has a different slope, and actually we can the conclusions can be very different depending on the parameter used. So for convenience, we put this graph on two-dimensional graph, and you can, where the yellow area is where upward mobility is higher than downward mobility, and the blue area when downward mobility is higher than upward mobility. And what we can say? We can say, for example, let's take a look at the first graph for unconditional mobility. When we use adult scale parameter equals 1, it's called per capita approach, we can always observe more upward unconditional mobility for all of the values of child parameter. So we can do the same exercise for conditional mobility and take, for example, square root. So when adult scale parameter equals 0.5. In this case, we will have more downward mobility for all of the child parameters. So our main conclusion is that selection of the scale parameters can significantly change estimation results for income mobility and income dynamic. We said a lot of, we have done a lot of robustness checks as well as account for the reference group, and our results were robust to all of the sensitivity analysis. And I will talk very briefly. So we estimate our subjective scales, some new poverty lines for country, and our main results are that chronic poverty and income mobility are significantly depends on scaling, and the conclusion can be very different on the scale parameter used. Thank you so much, and sorry for late. Yeah.
Okay, I was asked to discuss also this paper, although I have never worked on subjective poverty, but I'm not going to summarize the paper. It's lunchtime, and the author just summarized it. Let me say the following thing. If I had been discussing 3-4 months ago, I would just have said positive, very positive things on the paper. But I came across a paper too that was published in 2017, but which I read only 2-3 months ago, by Carsten Schröder and Yitzhaki, which questioned very much the robustness of your result. The paper is not only on happiness, it's on any time you have a dependent variable which is ordinal. And since well-being is a latent variable that is impossible to observe directly, we only observe the ordinal data. In the question you mentioned, people were asked to evaluate their own level of material welfare on a 9-point scale from poor to rich. So it's an ordinal variable, and therefore monotonic increasing transformation are permissible. The problem is that such transformation can reverse the conclusion you reached. And in this very nice paper that was published 2 years ago in European Economic Review, the Schröder and Yitzhaki gave 2 conditions under which the results obtained are robust to monotonic increasing transformation of the ordinal variable. The first condition has to do with the comparison of means, and the second condition has to do with the robustness of the sign of a simple OLS regression coefficient, which means only one explanatory variable, and they don't analyze the case of multiple regression, so there's work to do on this topic. So what's the first condition? The first condition is well known from expected utility theory for economics of inequality, a basic paper by Hanoch and Levy and by Hadar and Russell, and I think also by Rothschild and Stiglitz, if I am not mistaken. And the first order stochastic dominance of one distribution compared to another, the rankings of expected value are invariant to monotonic increasing transformation. Otherwise, it would be possible to find monotonic increasing transformation that would change the rankings. So that's the first condition. You look at first order stochastic dominance. The second condition relies on the concept of what Yitzhaki and Schertman have called LMA curve, the line of independence minus the absolute concentration curve. Actually, it's I think instead of doing this difference, you simply, it has to do with the generalized Lorentz curve. As you know, at the difference of the Lorentz curve on the horizontal axis, it's the same thing as the Lorentz curve, but on the vertical axis, you multiply the cumulative income share by the mean, okay? And an absolute concentration curve, you rank on the vertical axis, let's say this variable y, it's cumulative of y divided by the number of observations so that you end up at the mean. You do not rank it by y, but by some x, all right? And then the idea is to check whether this absolute concentration curve is going to cut the line which links the 0, 0 point, the origin, to the point which is on the horizontal axis at 1 and on the vertical axis at the mean. If it cuts, then you have transformation of the functional transformation which can lead to different results. Okay, so that's the basic idea. Now, in the empirical part of their paper, Schröder and Yitzhaki showed that intersection of group-specific cumulative distribution are highly likely in empirical satisfaction data. And in the second part of the empirical section of the paper, they showed that it doesn't suffice to scrutinize the sensitivity of regression results to different econometric models, as you did OLS, you did pooled OLS, you did ordered logit, and BUC, even sophisticated ordered logit, for a given arbitrary well-being scale, which is exactly what you did. Because the findings can be reversed by means of admissible monotonic increasing transformation of the well-being scale. Now, as I said before, Schröder and Yitzhaki only worked with simple regression. You worked with multiple regression. I don't know how to do it with the check with multiple, but you can do it with checking, the dependent variable versus each of the explanatory variables you use. So I think it is worthwhile to do this check. I originally prepared the illustration, but short of time, I decided not to present it. Now, some other remark, which is related to what I said before for the previous paper. You do not seem to have included a variable corresponding to some reference income. So as I said before, it could be the income of those living in the area, or you do some regression on education, age, gender, health, and so on. Now, there is a paper which did this by Claudia Senig, and it's on well-being, subjective well-being in Russia. And she found that deposit for the income, to check whether the income reference group has an effect on subjective well-being. Now, she did something she wrote something quite interesting. She just said the result that in an unstable, the question is, when your reference income is higher than your actual income, do you feel bad or do you feel well? So she said that actually you can also feel well because it may be an information. Actually, it's an ID which is called the tunnel parabole. It's a very known paper by Alfred O. Hirschman with an index by Michael Rothschild, who probably at that time was a very young economist. Alfred O. Hirschman, as you may know, is one of the most original economists of the 20th century. And he was stuck, he lived in Boston for a while, and he was stuck in the tunnel. And there were several lines, and the line next to his line was getting quicker. So he asked the question, do I feel bad or do I feel well? And he said, you may feel well because you may think if this line is moving, then sooner or later I will be moving. And he applied this to economic development, saying that when you see that other people are progressing, getting a higher standard of living than yours, you may feel well because you think, well, they are progressing now, but I will progress soon. So Claudia Senig applied the same idea to her in her paper in Headcount. Well, I think I'll stop here.
We're already on time. How many questions? Ryan, comments, last
related to general expression, somehow I'm going to the one between what's there. And this probably is when such a low result. Thank you so much for discussion. Yes, it's very important. I will take a look at the paper. And we will do all the checks that you suggested. Related to reference group, we tried to count the reference group. Actually, there is a very recent paper by Melanie Bora and colleagues that is based on German data and was published in Income Inequality and Wealth in 2018, last year. They showed that not controlling for reference group will lead to overestimating of adulthood parameter, as I remember. So it's very crucial, yes, it's very crucial to account for the reference group when we are working with some subjective indicators of the welfare. We try to account for the reference group when I calculated the income in the area, in the same area with of the household in the same composition. So our results were robust to inclusion of the reference group, and actually the inclusion of the reference group were very significant in our regression. But anyway, it was at least it was the scale parameter was robust. Related to Evgenia question, yes, it's probably, of course, childhood parameter can be underestimated because of the happiness you are talking about this. Yes, but we are arguing that we are using very long panel data. In this very long panel data, we have a lot of parents, a lot of families who are having not the first child, but the second one, the third one child, any additional child. And in this case, the happiness will be the fixed effect, an observed fixed effect that can be eliminated with some econometric methods.
Thank you very much. I think we can have to close the session with this. The next plenary session will start at 1:45. I would like to thank everybody for attending this session and for the interesting discussion, and of course our presenters and discussants for their fruitful contributions. Thank you very much.